When Larry Geller was finally asked the question, he didn't answer right away. He just stared down at his hands, as if the truth might be hiding in the wrinkles of his own skin. "If you had to name one thing," the interviewer said softly, "the one power that destroyed Elvis Presley, what would it be?" The room went quiet. Larry had been asked about Elvis 1,000 times in his life, about the music, the movies, the hair, the jumpsuits, the women. But this question was different. This wasn't about glitter. This was about the wound underneath. He opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. For a long moment, all he could see in his mind was Elvis's face. Sweat on his brow under the stage lights, a handful of pills in his palm. That tired little half-smile he put on when he wanted to look strong, even when his eyes were begging for help. Larry swallowed hard. "It wasn't the drugs," he finally whispered. "It wasn't the women, it wasn't even the fame." He paused, his voice cracking just enough for you to hear the years he'd spent holding this in. "It was something much darker, and it had all of us under its spell, including me." He looked up, almost as if he regretted saying even that. Because once you say something like that out loud, you can't take it back. The moment you name the force that destroyed Elvis, you start to realize the cost of your own silence. And that's when Larry added something he had never admitted in public before. "I've carried this with me my whole life," he said. "I'm 73 years old now. If I don't say it now, I never will." Right there you can feel it, can't you? The weight of a man who watched the most famous entertainer on earth disappear, not in one dramatic collapse, but in slow, painful pieces. The guilt of knowing he saw the warning signs, the fear of what would have happened if he'd spoken out back then. Because everybody thinks they know what killed Elvis. Some say it was the pills. Some point at the pressure. Others blame the people around him, greedy, careless, or worse. But Larry didn't talk like a gossip columnist. He talked like someone who had looked into Elvis's eyes at 3 in the morning and seen something break behind them. And the way he tells it, the real power that destroyed Elvis wasn't one event, one person, or one single bad habit. It was something that started off looking like love and ended up looking a lot more like ownership. You're going to hear Larry's own words. You're going to step into those late-night conversations, the locked rooms, the hushed arguments behind closed doors. You're going to feel that moment when Elvis himself realized, "I don't own my life anymore, they do." But before we get there, before we name that power and trace how it wrapped its fingers around Elvis's throat, you need to understand who Larry Geller really was, and why this gentle, spiritual, soft-spoken man was the one person Elvis trusted with the questions he never asked anyone else. Because if you think Larry was just the hairdresser, you're about to find out how wrong that is. Most people knew Larry as the man who styled Elvis Presley's hair. They saw the photos. They saw the perfect pompadours, the jet-black waves sculpted into place before a show. They saw a guy with a comb, a blow-dryer, and a backstage pass. What they didn't see was what happened after the mirror fogged up. After the last hair was sprayed. After the suits were laid out and the entourage drifted away. They didn't see Elvis sitting there in that chair, staring at his own reflection and asking questions no superstar is supposed to ask. "Do you think God put me here for a reason, Larry? Why do I feel so empty when the crowd goes home? Why do I feel like I'm not living my own life anymore?" This is where Larry's role becomes something else entirely. He wasn't just the man behind the image. He became the keeper of Elvis's soul-searching. The friend who brought him books about faith and philosophy. The one who never laughed when Elvis said he felt like there was a spiritual war going on inside him. And if you're wondering why that matters to the story of what destroyed Elvis, remember this. You only confess your deepest fears to the person you think might understand them. Larry saw both sides of Elvis's world. He saw the fans screaming outside the gates, begging for a glimpse. And he saw the man on the inside of those gates whispering, "Sometimes I wish I could just be anonymous for one day." He saw the glory, but he also saw the leash. To this day, Larry says that Elvis was fighting two lives at once. On one side, there was the Elvis the world demanded. The king of rock and roll. The man who had to fill arenas, sell out Las Vegas, and keep a lot of hungry mouths fed. The brand, the business, the machine. On the other side, there was the Elvis who lay awake at night, talking about scripture, karma, life after death. The Elvis who wondered if he'd traded something sacred for something shiny. The Elvis who quietly asked, "What's the point of all this if I'm miserable?" And every time that second Elvis tried to breathe, the power around him seemed to tighten. Here, where the story gets even more uncomfortable. Because the force that destroyed Elvis didn't walk into his life like a villain in a black hat. It came in smiling. It came in with contracts, promises, paychecks. It came in with the same tone that says, "We love you, kid. We're going to make you a star." It came with the kind of love that always had a condition attached. You give us your voice. You give us your face. You give us your body. You give us your time. And in return, we'll give you the world. As long as you never stop. Larry watched this play out from just inches away. He watched Elvis bow his head before a show and say, "God, help me get through this." Then stand up because someone outside the door needed him on stage in 5 minutes, no matter how he felt inside. He watched the bottles pile up, not because Elvis was a cartoon of rock and roll excess, but because it was the only way he knew to calm his nerves, manage the pain, and keep up with what everyone demanded. Were there bad choices? Of course. Was there personal responsibility? Absolutely. But Larry insists on something people don't like to think about. When a man is surrounded from every side by a machine that profits from his self-destruction, how much of that destruction is really just his fault? That's why, when Larry hesitated in that chair at 73, looking down at his hands, he wasn't just thinking about Elvis. He was thinking about the people who kept pushing him. He was thinking about the nights he saw Elvis beg for rest and be met with a schedule. He was thinking about the times he himself stayed quiet because he didn't want to be the one who caused trouble. He was thinking about a kind of power that doesn't just control one person. It controls everyone around them too. You might be wondering, if Larry saw all this, why are we only hearing the full truth now? Why didn't he shout it from the rooftops in the 70s? Why didn't he confront the people he believed were hurting Elvis? Why didn't he walk away and tell the world what he'd seen? Those questions haunt him. He said it himself, "I wish I had done more, I wish I had spoken sooner." But fear is a powerful thing. Fear of losing your place. Fear of being shut out. Fear of being blamed when everything goes wrong. And in Elvis's world, that fear didn't just belong to Larry. It belonged to everyone who depended on the King's next show, next tour, next paycheck. That's how a power like this survives. By convincing good people to keep their mouth shut. By the time Larry finally chose to break his own silence, decades had passed. The dust had settled. The headlines had turned Elvis's final years into a tragic legend. The official story had already been written. Drugs, heart, lifestyle. Easy, simple labels that let everyone move on. But Larry knew the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. And it definitely wasn't comfortable. So when he finally answered that question, when he finally said it wasn't just the pills, it was the power behind them, he wasn't just naming what destroyed Elvis. He was confessing how close he'd been to it, and how it still scared him even all these years later. And that brings us to the heart of this story. Because if you really want to understand the power that destroyed Elvis Presley, you can't start with the end. You can't start with a body on the bathroom floor and a list of medications on a coroner's report. You have to start with a young man who thought he'd found a friend. A soft-spoken hairstylist with a mind full of big questions. A man who walked into Elvis's life to fix the outside, and ended up holding some of the deepest secrets on the inside. Who was Larry Geller before all this? What did he see when he first stepped into Elvis's world? And at what moment did he realize that the dream he'd walked into was already starting to look like a trap? To answer that, we have to go back to the very beginning. To the first day Larry touched Elvis's hair. And the first night Elvis looked at him and asked a question that still echoes today. The first time Larry Geller heard Elvis Presley's name, it wasn't coming from a jukebox or a screaming fan outside a hotel. It was coming from his boss. "Larry, we've got a new client for you," he said. "Big one. You ever heard of Elvis Presley?" Larry had heard the name, of course. Everybody had. But to him, Elvis wasn't a god yet. He was another face on a record sleeve, another headline, another distant star in a sky full of them. At least, that's what Larry thought, until the day he walked onto that set. Before Elvis, Larry's world was already built around image. He worked in Hollywood, styling the hair of actors and actresses, helping them become whoever the camera needed them to be. By day, he sculpted illusions. By night, he pulled out his books, thick, dog-eared volumes on religion, mysticism, philosophy, and tried to figure out who he really was. He would sit alone in his small apartment, reading about Jesus and Buddha, prophets and poets, destiny and free will. He had this quiet belief that life wasn't just random, that people came into your story for a reason. What he didn't know was that his next client would turn out to be the center of a storm that would test every belief he had. When Larry stepped onto the movie set where Elvis was working, he felt it before he saw him. The air was different. People moved faster. Voices were louder. There was this strange mix of fear and excitement, like everyone was preparing for a king and hoping they wouldn't mess up the welcome. Then he saw him. Elvis wasn't on stage. He wasn't in some dramatic pose. He was sitting quietly in a chair, in between takes, head slightly bowed, hands folded in his lap. For a second, he just looked like a tired young man. And then he lifted his head, and the room changed. There was something disarming about his eyes. They were famous eyes. But up close, there was a softness that surprised Larry, a kind of tired curiosity, as if Elvis was constantly studying the people around him, trying to decide who was real. "You're the new guy?" Elvis asked, a little smile playing at his lips. "Yes, sir, Larry," he said. "Elvis," he replied, as if Larry might not know. It should have been a simple, working relationship. Do the hair, make the star look good, get out of the way. But the shift came in the smallest, most unexpected moment. A few days into the job, during a break, Larry sat off to the side and pulled a book out of his bag. It wasn't a magazine. It wasn't a script. It was a spiritual book, dense and quiet, full of underlined passages and notes scribbled in the margins. Elvis noticed. "What you reading there, man?" he asked, leaning forward. Larry hesitated. He'd been teased before about his interests, about all his deep stuff. But something in Elvis's tone sounded genuinely curious. It's about purpose," Larry said. "Why we're here, why we go through what we go through, that kind of thing." Elvis reached out his hand. "Let me see that." He took the book, flipped through the pages, moved his lips silently over a few lines. Then he looked back at Larry with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You read this kind of thing a lot." "All the time," Larry said. Elvis nodded slowly. "I've been looking for somebody like you," he murmured. That was the moment everything changed. Because from that point on, Larry wasn't just the man who fixed Elvis's hair. He became something else. A quiet witness. A companion on a spiritual search that almost nobody knew Elvis was on. After that day, the pattern began. They would finish work. The crowds would go home. The lights would dim. And somewhere, in a dressing room or a hotel suite, Elvis and Larry would be sitting across from each other with books spread out on the table. The King of Rock and Roll reading about God, the soul, and destiny. The world never saw that. But Larry did. He saw Elvis's hunger, not for applause, but for meaning. Elvis was searching, Larry would say later. He wanted to understand why he'd been given this life. He didn't just want to sing, he wanted to know. And yet, even in those early days, as Larry was discovering this curious, thoughtful side of Elvis, something else was lurking just outside every room they sat in. The machine. You could hear it in the constant ringing of phones. You could see it in the way people hovered around the door, always waiting for Elvis to be ready for the next obligation. You could feel it in the way conversations were cut short because somebody needed a decision, a signature, a performance. Larry remembers those interruptions vividly. They would be halfway through discussing some passage about free will when the door would open. "We gotta go, you're due on set." "The colonel wants to talk to you." "The car's waiting." Each time, Larry saw the same look flicker across Elvis's face. A mix of resignation and duty. Like a soldier hearing the call of a trumpet he couldn't ignore. He would close the book gently, as if he was putting away a piece of himself, and say, "We'll get back to this later, Larry." But later didn't always come. As the months and years passed, Larry got a front-row seat to a world that looked dazzling on the outside and suffocating on the inside. He saw how many people depended on Elvis's every move: band members, staff, managers, promoters, family, friends, strangers he'd never met. He saw how every show, every album, every appearance wasn't just art. It was income, leverage, bargaining power. He started to recognize a pattern. When Elvis talked about God, about peace, about taking time off, the room felt small and safe. When he talked about contracts, tour, and money, the room filled up with other people's opinions. "You can't cancel. You can't rest now. You can't change direction. You know how much is riding on this." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Larry began to understand. Elvis Presley wasn't just a person. He was an industry. And industries don't care how tired you are. They care how much you can keep producing. That was Larry's first glimpse of the power he would one day say destroyed Elvis. Not as a lightning bolt, not as a single moment, but as a presence. Always there. Always hungry. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he could feel it pushing in on the edges of every private conversation. Reminding Elvis what he owed. Reminding everyone what they stood to lose if he ever said enough. And as Larry would soon find out, that pressure was only going to get worse. Because the more Elvis searched for meaning, the more the machine demanded that he stay exactly where he was. There came a point when Larry realized Elvis was living two lives that were slowly tearing each other apart. On one side, there was the Elvis the world knew. The man bathed in spotlights. The voice that filled arenas and rattled windows. The iconic silhouette in a jumpsuit, cape flaring as the crowd lost its mind. This Elvis was scheduled down to the minute. Wake up, rehearse, travel, perform, smile, shake hands, sign, repeat. He was the one everyone saw, and the one everyone made money from. On the other side, there was the Elvis only a handful of people ever saw. The man who sat up late, cross-legged on the floor, reading spiritual texts with Larry. The man who asked, "Do you think I'm doing what I was meant to do, or did I take a wrong turn somewhere?" The man who sometimes fell silent in the middle of a joke, his face clouded with a sadness he didn't have a name for. Larry watched these two Elvises bump into each other more and more. The public Elvis had to be bulletproof. The private Elvis was cracking. The tension between them grew in small ways at first. A rehearsed smile that took a little longer to appear. A show he didn't want to do, but did anyway. A conversation with Larry cut off because someone knocked and said, "The contract's here, we need you to sign." The word "need" followed Elvis everywhere. "They need you in Vegas. They need you to do another tour. They need you to say yes." It sounded like flattery. But to Larry, it started to sound like a chain. He began to notice another layer of that chain, the invisible contracts. Not just the ones on paper. The emotional contracts. The unspoken agreements. Elvis had grown up poor. He knew what it meant to have nothing. Now that he had everything, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of people who depended on him. Family, friends, employees, people with mortgages, kids, dreams of their own, all tied to one man's ability to keep walking out on stage. So when Elvis dared to say, "I need a break," the response was never simple. It wasn't, "Okay, rest." It was, "If you stop now, a lot of people are going to suffer." And that is a heavy thing to carry on your shoulders, especially when you're already exhausted. To numb the anxiety, to push through the pain, to manage the physical toll of performances that demanded everything from his body, Elvis began to lean more and more on pills. Larry saw it. He saw the bottles appear, change, multiply. He saw the way they were passed around, not as something shameful, but as something practical. "You need to sleep. We've got something for that. You need to get up. We've got something for that too." To the outside world, it looked like classic rock and roll excess. But from where Larry stood, it looked like something even darker. Medication being used not just to soothe pain, but to keep a machine running that should have been shut down and repaired. He tried, in small ways, to push back. He would say, "Maybe you should slow down." He would say, "You don't have to do everything they ask." He would gently suggest, "What if you took time off to really focus on this spiritual path you keep talking about?" And sometimes, for a moment, Elvis would look like he wanted to say yes. He would imagine it out loud. "Can you picture it, man?" he'd say to Larry. "Just me, no schedule, no shows, just time, time to read, time to think, time to be a father, a friend, a real person again." Those were the moments when hope flickered. But then the knock would come. The call would come. The reminder. We've got a contract. We've already sold the tickets. If you walk now, you'll be in breach. You know what that means." And that's when Larry saw something that chilled him more than the pills ever did. He saw fear in Elvis's eyes. Not fear of the crowd. Not fear of performing. Fear of what would happen if he stopped performing. Fear of lawsuits. Fear of being called ungrateful or unstable. Fear of letting down everyone who depended on him. Fear of losing the empire he'd built for the people he loved. That fear wasn't coming from inside Elvis. It was being fed to him. Fed by people who had everything to gain from keeping him on stage and everything to lose if he stepped off of it. The arguments behind closed doors got sharper. Elvis would talk about changing his act, pulling back on certain commitments, exploring new directions. He wanted to sing different songs, tell different stories, step out of the box he'd been put in years ago. Some people around him understood. Some were even excited. But others heard change and translated it into one word: risk. And for them, risk wasn't spiritual. It was financial. Whenever Elvis leaned toward freedom, they leaned harder on fear. You can't walk away now. Do you know what that will do to your image? You think they'll still love you if you're not out there every night. Elvis stood in the middle of those voices, torn between the man who wanted to follow his soul and the image that had been sold to the world. Larry watched, feeling smaller by the day. He was closer to Elvis than almost anyone when it came to matters of the heart and soul. But when it came to contracts, money, and control, he often felt like a guest in someone else's house. He would leave those tense rooms and walk back to his own, stomach knotted, mind racing. Could he do more? Should he confront the people around Elvis? Should he tell Elvis to walk away, no matter the cost? And then another thought would creep in, one he's admitted with shame in his later years. What happens to me if I become the one who causes trouble? Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And it whispered to Larry too. Stay quiet. Don't rock the boat. Be grateful you're even here. Years later, when he talked about the power that destroyed Elvis, Larry didn't place himself outside of it. He saw how it had reached into his own decisions, his own silences. Because that's what real power does. It doesn't just control the star. It controls everyone who loves the star. Everyone who depends on the star. Everyone who is afraid of what happens if the star says no. By now, the tension around Elvis wasn't a series of isolated moments. It was a constant pressure. A man searching for God in a room full of people searching for the next payday. A soul crying out for rest in a world that only applauded motion. And Larry, sitting there with a book in his hands, watching his friend being pulled in two directions, began to realize something that terrified him. This wasn't going to slow down. This wasn't going to ease off. This was building toward something. A breaking point. A moment when Elvis would have to make a choice between the life everyone else wanted from him and the life he was desperately trying to find for himself. And when that moment finally came, the power Larry would one day name out loud was going to show its face in a way he could never unsee. The breaking point didn't arrive with a press conference or a dramatic announcement. It slipped in quietly on a night that was supposed to look like every other night of the tour. The crowd was already roaring. The band was tuned and ready. The lights were hot, the jumpsuit was on, and somewhere just off stage, a handful of people were checking their watches, their ledgers, their nerves. But backstage, for a moment, everything went still. Elvis was sitting in front of a mirror again. The same ritual. The same chair. The same face staring back at him. Only this time, something about that face frightened Larry. He'd seen Elvis tired before. He'd seen him stressed, drained, even angry. But this was different. Elvis looked hollow. His eyes were ringed with shadows. His shoulders sagged like the weight of an entire city was pressing down on them. His hands trembled just slightly when he reached for the water glass. Larry stood behind him, comb in hand, pretending to focus on a stray piece of hair, but really he was waiting. Waiting for Elvis to say something. Anything. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. Larry, he said quietly, eyes still locked on the mirror, do you ever feel like you're watching somebody else live your life? Larry's stomach tightened. What do you mean? He asked, though he already knew. Elvis gave a strained little smile. I see that man out there, he said, nodding toward his own reflection. The suits, the lights, the whole thing, everybody loves him, everybody needs him. He paused. But I don't know if I know him anymore. Larry felt the familiar mix of helplessness and urgency building inside him. He'd heard versions of this before. Late-night confessions. Moments where the mask slipped and the man underneath gasped for air. But tonight, there was a different tone. A finality. As if Elvis wasn't just venting, he was reaching for something. "You're Elvis Presley," Larry said gently. "You're allowed to figure out who that is." Elvis shook his head. "No, man, I was Elvis Presley. Now I'm whatever they write on that schedule." He reached over and picked up a folded stack of papers. "Show dates. Times. Obligations." He tossed them back down like they burned his hand. "I don't own my time. I don't own my body. I don't even own my own name. They own it, all of it." The word hung in the air. They. It was a word Elvis used a lot in those days. Sometimes it meant managers. Sometimes promoters. Sometimes lawyers. Sometimes the whole faceless mass of people who fed off his image. Tonight, it sounded bigger than all of them. "Elvis," Larry said, choosing his words carefully, "you can say no, you can walk away. You know that, right?" Elvis looked at him like he envied his innocence. "Walk away to what?" he asked. "You think they'll just let me disappear? You think the lawsuits stop? You think the headlines don't tear me apart?" He leaned in closer to the mirror, his eyes dark and searching. "They turn me into a king, Larry," he whispered, "but a king is just a prisoner with better clothes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the door, they could hear the murmur of the crowd, the distant thud of the band warming up, the impatient footsteps of someone waiting to knock. Larry felt a sudden surge of desperation. "Then stop," he said. "Just stop. Take time, heal, find what you've been looking for. You talk about God, about purpose, about wanting a different life. Maybe this is the moment. Maybe you're supposed to walk away." Elvis closed his eyes. And for a heartbeat, it looked like he might say yes. You could almost see it, the alternate reality where Elvis hands the microphone back, walks out into the night as a free man, and never looks back. Where the machine sputters and dies, because the man it was built around finally refuses to keep it alive. But then came the knock. 3 sharp taps on the door. 5 minutes, someone called. They're waiting." Elvis's shoulders lifted and dropped with a deep, weary breath. He opened his eyes again, and something in them had dimmed. "You hear that?" he said softly. "They're always waiting, not for me, for what I can do for them." He reached over to the table, fingers brushing past the books he and Larry had been reading, past the half-finished cup of coffee, and stopping on the small, familiar bottles. Larry watched, heart pounding, as Elvis picked one up. "Don't," Larry said, the word escaping before he could stop it. Elvis looked at him, not angry, not defensive, just tired. "Larry," he said, "I gotta get through the show. I can't walk out there like this. Like this. Exhausted. Shaken. Broken in places no one could see." "You don't understand," Elvis continued. "If I don't go out there, it's not just me who pays the price, it's everybody." And there it was. The noose disguised as responsibility. The power that told him he was too important to rest, too valuable to say no, too needed to be human. He swallowed the pills. Larry felt something inside him crack. Because in that moment, he realized he was watching a man choose between 2 prisons. The one made of contracts, expectations, and fear. And the one made of chemicals that allowed him to survive the first. Elvis stood up slowly, adjusting his outfit. He caught Larry's eye in the mirror. "Pray for me, man," he said. "I do," Larry replied, his voice barely holding steady, "every night." Elvis gave a faint smile. Then pray double tonight. And with that, he walked out of the room, toward the roar of the crowd, toward the spotlights, toward the hungry machine wearing 1,000 faces. Larry stayed behind for a second, staring at the empty chair. Later, he would look back at that night as the moment he truly saw the power that was killing Elvis. Not the pills alone. Not the schedule alone. Not the people alone. But all of it combined into something with its own heartbeat. Its own appetite. Something that demanded sacrifice. He didn't have a perfect name for it then. But years later, at 73, when someone finally asked him that question, what was the power that destroyed Elvis? He went back there in his mind. To the mirror. To the pills. To the knock on the door. To the fear in Elvis's voice when he said, "They own it, all of it." And that was when Larry finally found the words. When Larry talks about that period now, he doesn't sound like a man pointing fingers from a distance. He sounds like someone standing in the wreckage, trying to understand how the building collapsed while he was still inside it. He remembers the phone calls after shows, the frantic energy, the concern that never seemed to focus on the one thing that mattered most: Elvis's health, Elvis's spirit, Elvis's breaking point. If Elvis was late, the questions weren't, "Is he okay?" They were, "Is the show in danger? Is the contract in danger? Is the money in danger?" This, Larry says, is where the truth gets ugly. Because the power that destroyed Elvis didn't just come from one person in a colonel's hat or one doctor with a prescription pad. It came from a system that had learned how to turn a human being into a product, and then convince everyone around that product that their own survival depended on keeping it on the shelf. Even if it was cracking. Even if it was poisoning itself to shine. Larry has described it like a spiritual trap. On the surface, it looked like success. Sold-out shows. Endless demand. Crowds who still screamed his name like it was a prayer. But underneath, it was a kind of bondage. A loss of self. A surrender of free will, one small compromise at a time. You'll hear him say it in different words across different interviews and writings, but the meaning is the same. What destroyed Elvis, he says, was the power of control, the machine, the business, the fear that kept him from walking away. Fear. Control. The machine. Those aren't abstract ideas to Larry. They're memories. He remembers watching Elvis try to push against it. There were times when Elvis talked seriously about changing everything. Doing more meaningful work. Leaving Vegas. Breaking away from certain people. Going somewhere far from the spotlight to rediscover who he really was. He wanted to do movies that mattered, Larry recalls. He wanted to sing songs that spoke to his soul. He wanted to help people spiritually, emotionally. He didn't just want to entertain, he wanted to serve. But every time Elvis leaned toward that path, something leaned back harder. Reminding him of commitments. Reminding him of debts. Reminding him of the empire built in his name that could come crashing down. Sometimes it was an argument. Sometimes it was a guilt trip. Sometimes it was a simple, chilling line. "Don't forget who made you, kid." That line, Larry says, haunted Elvis. Because as much as he believed that God had given him his talent, he was constantly surrounded by people who wanted him to believe a different story. That without them, the handlers, the deals, the machine, he was nothing. This is where the spiritual side of Larry's perspective becomes unavoidable. He doesn't just see what happened to Elvis as bad management or unfortunate circumstances. He sees it as a spiritual assault. A man can lose himself, he says, when he forgets where his worth really comes from. Elvis started to feel like his value was only in what he could give other people, and when he believed that, he became vulnerable to anyone who could threaten to take that away. In other words, the real power that destroyed Elvis wasn't a single villain standing in a hallway. It was a belief planted deep in his heart. If you stop giving, you stop mattering. Once that seed takes root, it doesn't need much help to grow. It feeds on fear. It feeds on exhaustion. It feeds on the desperate hope that maybe if you just do one more show, one more tour, one more run in Vegas, the emptiness will finally go away. Larry watched that hope fade. And he watched something else take its place. Resignation. Elvis started to talk like a man who no longer believed his life could change. He started phrases with, "I have to, more than I want to." He let decisions be made around him, about him, without truly being for him. There were still moments of light. Moments where the music lifted him. Moments where the connection with the audience felt pure and electric and real. But afterward, when the crowd's roar faded and the hotel room door closed, the silence felt heavier than ever. Larry remembers one of those nights with painful clarity. Elvis had just finished a performance that, from the outside, looked triumphant. The audience went wild. The critics would call it powerful. The casino would call it profitable. Back in the room, Elvis sank into a chair, chest heaving, sweat still damp on his forehead. Larry was there. So were the bottles. For a long time, no one said anything. Then Elvis spoke. "You know, man," he said, not looking up, "they're going to keep doing this until there's nothing left." "Doing what?" Larry asked, even though he already knew. "Taking," Elvis replied, "taking and taking and taking, and I'm the one who keeps handing it over." He finally looked up, eyes glassy, not from substances, but from something deeper. "You want to know the truth, Larry?" he asked. "Sometimes I think the only way this ends is if I die." Those words landed like a stone in the room. Larry felt sick. "Don't say that," he whispered. "Don't ever say that." But Elvis just shrugged. "I don't mean I want to," he said. "I just don't see any other way off this train." That sentence would ring in Larry's ears for years. Because that was the moment he realized Elvis wasn't just tired. He was trapped. Trapped in a life that looked like a dream and felt like a cage. Trapped in a story that everyone else was writing for him. Trapped by the very power that had lifted him up in the first place. And that power knew exactly how to keep him there. Every time he doubted himself, it reminded him of his fans. Every time he wanted to stop, it reminded him of the people on his payroll. Every time he craved a simpler life, it whispered, "You don't get to be normal anymore. You're Elvis Presley, forever." Years later, when Larry finally sat down and allowed himself to really talk about these moments, he didn't soften them. He didn't excuse the machine. He didn't excuse himself. He admitted that he, too, was afraid. Afraid of speaking up. Afraid of being pushed away. Afraid of losing his place at Elvis's side. But he also admitted something more painful. That Elvis had given him more trust than almost anyone, and that trust came with a responsibility he didn't fully live up to. At 73, when he finally put the pieces together and called it what it was, he said the words he wishes he had found earlier. Elvis wasn't destroyed by his talent or his fans or even by his own weaknesses. He was destroyed by a power built on fear, control, and the belief that he couldn't walk away. And as heavy as that truth is, it isn't the end of the story. Because what happened after Elvis was gone, how the world reacted, how the blame was assigned, and how Larry chose to finally tell his side, would determine whether that power got to write the final chapter of Elvis's life, or whether the people who truly loved him would. In the end, that's the real question, isn't it? Who gets to write Elvis Presley's story, the machine that drained him, or the people who still feel him like a heartbeat. Because after Elvis was gone, the power that helped destroy him didn't just vanish. It tried to do what it always does. Package the tragedy. Sell the myth. Turn a broken man into a neat headline. Drugs. Heart attack. End of story. For years, that was the easy version the world accepted. It kept everything tidy. It kept the blame simple. It kept the machine untouched. But in the quiet corners, away from the flashbulbs and documentaries, there were people who couldn't live with that version. People like Larry. He was one of the few who had seen Elvis as more than a cautionary tale. He'd watched him wrestle with God, with purpose, with a destiny that felt too big for one human being to carry. He'd heard Elvis talk about wanting to heal people through music. Not just entertain them. Not just distract them. Heal them. And that's the part Larry didn't see reflected when people talked about Elvis as a punchline or a symbol of excess or just a tragic celebrity statistic. So in his 70s, when most people are slowing down, Larry did something he'd been too afraid to do when it might have made him enemies. He started telling the whole truth. Not just about the pills and the schedule and the controlling figures, but about the man behind all of it. The one who prayed before shows. The one who gave away cars and jewelry because he couldn't stand to see someone struggling. The one who'd stay up until dawn with a friend, talking about life and death and what comes after, even when he had a show the next night. Larry wanted the world to know that Elvis wasn't destroyed because he was weak. He was destroyed because he was human in a world that treated him like a resource. That distinction matters. Because if you believe Elvis was just reckless and foolish, the story ends with judgment. Look what he did to himself. But if you see what Larry saw, a sensitive, searching soul swallowed up by a power built on fear and control, the story ends with something else. Responsibility. Not just for the people around Elvis, but for us. For the way we talk about fame. For the way we demand access to people until there's nothing left of them. For the way we still cheer when someone is clearly falling apart in public, as long as they keep performing. Larry's late-life confessions aren't just about the past. They're a warning about the present. He said it plainly. What happened to Elvis is still happening, different faces, same power. You can see it today in the headlines about artists collapsing on tour. In the stories about breakdowns, overdoses, sudden cancellations that get mocked instead of understood. In the way people talk about the industry like it's a weather system, inevitable, uncontrollable, unstoppable. But Larry doesn't just want us to shake our heads and say, "That's sad." He wants us to ask harder questions. Like, why do we reward the machine more than the human being? Why do we protect the brand, but not the heart behind it? Why are we more forgiving of the system that breaks people than of the people who finally break? And maybe the hardest question of all. When we talk about Elvis, are we telling the truth that might save somebody now or the lie that lets everybody off the hook? That's where you come in. Because no matter how powerful the machine was, it never got the one thing it wanted most. It never got his legacy. That belongs to the fans. To the people who still play the records, not as background noise, but as a kind of prayer. To the ones who cry when they hear certain songs and can't explain why. To the ones who see beyond the jumpsuits and the gossip and feel the fragile, generous heart that beat underneath. Larry knows this. It's why, when he finally opened up fully, his tone wasn't just angry. It was grieving. He was grieving for his friend, for his own silence, for the years when the story of Elvis got flattened into something easy and empty. But he was also hopeful. hopeful that if he could pull back the curtain on the power that destroyed Elvis, maybe the next generation would be more careful with their heroes. More suspicious of the system. More protective of the souls behind the songs. He doesn't pretend to be a saint. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He still carries regret, especially about the times when Elvis was begging for a way out and he didn't push harder. I loved him, Larry has said. I really loved him, and I wish I had done more with that love. That's a heavy sentence, but it's also a gift, because it's a reminder that love without courage isn't enough, and that courage without love can become cruelty. When you look at Elvis's story through Larry's eyes, you start to see something else. Elvis didn't just leave behind music. He left behind a question. What is a life worth? Is it worth the tour, the numbers, the headlines, or is it worth the late-night conversations no one ever saw? The quiet acts of kindness that made no money at all. The part of him that never fit into any contract. The searching, hurting, compassionate man who just wanted to feel whole. Larry's final contribution to Elvis's legacy isn't another salacious detail or dramatic revelation. It's a shift in focus, away from how did he die, and toward what was done to him. And finally, what are we still doing right now to people like him? When you strip away the machine, the money, the myth, you're left with something simple and devastating. A man who gave the world everything he had, and a world that didn't know when to stop asking. The miracle, the part the power never planned for, is that Elvis's spirit outlived all of that. It lives in the way fans still defend him. In the way they argue online, not about chart positions, but about his heart. In the way they light candles, visit Graceland, and talk about him as if he were a family member who left too soon. Larry's hope in speaking out at 73 was that this version of Elvis, the searching, trapped, big-hearted man trying to find God in a world that kept dragging him back to the stage, would become the one we remember most. Not the caricature, not the punchline, not the final bathroom scene played over and over, but the man who looked into a mirror one night and said, "I don't know if I know that guy anymore," and still walked out to sing because he couldn't bear the thought of letting people down. There is a kind of holiness in that. Not the perfect, polished kind. The bruised, exhausted kind that still chooses to show up. That's the Elvis Larry wants you to see. And maybe, if we listen to him, the next time we watch an artist unravel in public or hear about another tragic ending, we'll recognize the pattern sooner. We'll ask what kind of power is pulling the strings. We'll remember that behind every empire is a human being who bleeds. And we'll remember Elvis not as a man who threw it all away, but as a man who was never really given a fair chance to lay it down. So the question circles back to you, sitting here, listening to Larry's confession and Elvis's echo. When you talk about Elvis from now on, whose version of him will you tell? The one the machine wrote, or the one his friend finally had the courage to share? If you had been sitting in that room with Larry, hearing Elvis say he didn't see any way off the train but death, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, even if it meant being pushed out, or stayed silent like so many did? Tell me honestly in the comments. Your answer doesn't just honor Elvis's story, it says something about the world we're all helping to create right now.